Story time with Stephanie
Hi,
Storey.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time. I am thrilled for my guest today, who is an award-winning and New York Times internationally best-selling novelist, also historical fiction, so we have that in common. Many books. You'll have to look her up. You will love them all, but I'll name a couple. The Girl Who Came Home, a novel of the Titanic. The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, which is one of my favorites. But her current one, which just came out this month, is When We Were Young and Brave. We will talk about the plot. This is a beautiful book. It sucked me in from the first freaking page and didn't let me go. It's one of those. I'm just warning you at home. Welcome to the show, Hazel Gaynor.
Thank you. What an intro. Yeah, well, look, I've had lots of feedback that people have shed a few tears, but good tears. So it's great to hear that you were hooked from the beginning, because obviously that's what we want.
Oh, from the first page, I was like, what's going to happen to Nancy? I have to know.
Yeah.
Okay, but to get our viewers at home caught up, this is an era and just a moment in history that I knew nothing about, had never crossed my mind, knew nothing about Japanese internment of British schools in China during World War II. I mean, that's it, sort of.
Crazy, right?
This 10-year-old girl and this teacher. Tell my viewers at home a little bit about the story and what attracted you to it.
So absolutely the same, and I think readers have been exposed a lot recently. There's been a huge popularity surge in World War II fiction, but predominantly from the war in Europe. So we've read some astonishing, incredible stories about, the Holocaust, the Nazi invasions, and all of the repercussions across Europe. What we haven't heard so much about or read so much about is the other whole part of the war in the Pacific. And when I first heard the true story that inspired When We Were Young and Brave, I was exactly the same as you, Stephanie, and I was like, how do I not know this? And how did this whole set of circumstances surrounding a group of school children and their teachers who were moved from their school, a very elite, quite privileged boarding school called Chifu School, and they were taken to an internment camp for 4 years. And I first heard the story through This American Life podcast. And it started out as this quite innocent, quite amusing, really, anecdote about waylaid Girl Scout cookies. And through this sort of strange series of events, somebody had come to learn this incredible story about these children who were also Girl Guides. So that's the connection to the story in When We Were Young and Brave. And these incredible young children, some as young as 5, some just on the cusp of adulthood, who hadn't seen their parents already for a couple of years because it was a boarding school, and with the Japanese occupation of China, family life was already hugely disrupted. Then, following the events of Pearl Harbor and the US and British declaration of war with Japan, everything changed literally overnight. This world that these children knew was turned upside down. Japanese soldiers invaded their school, and life would never be the same again. And I, just like you, I wanted instantly to know more about that set of events, about how on earth the children had coped, how the teachers had coped, how did they manage, what were conditions like in the camp. And this huge piece of history just opened up to me, and I'm just so pleased that I have found that piece of history, because I can't really believe I didn't know much about it before, because it's such a vast part of Second World War. I think readers will probably be familiar with Empire of the Sun, which is an account of a young American boy's exact same experience in one of these internment camps. And When We Were Young and Brave takes, if you like, a not dissimilar approach to that narrative of a child's point of view in that very adult, very scary world. And we also see the same events from one of the teachers' points of view, which is completely contrasting. So that hopefully is a really interesting narrative device for readers to see those alternate points of view. So just astonishing. And, you know, sometimes I have to step back and remind myself this actually really happened. And it's just astonishing how well everybody coped given the circumstances they were faced with.
It really is an astonishing piece of history. It does, I mean, as all good historical fiction to me does, it makes me want to go read more about the real events. Like, it makes me want to go like, wait, I have to go find out about what really happened.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like, but this may or may not be true, from the way you describe it, you knew very quickly that this was something you wanted to dig into as a story, or did it take you a while? Because for those of you at home who are not historical fiction writers, it takes an enormous amount of time and passion and energy, and you gotta really love your subject matter to dig into writing a novel about it.
Don't you? Really? And, you know, sometimes you don't quite know what you're embarking on because you don't yet know what you don't know. So it's a real leap of faith, and I think all historical novelists have that. And it's that gut instinct of goosebumps when you see a piece of art, or you visit a museum, or you read something, or you listen to something like I did in the This American Life podcast. And I literally sat at my desk, and I remember I physically leant forward to make sure I was catching this story. And instantly, yes, I wanted to know more, but was also extremely daunted by the prospect, because this is enormous. The whole of the Second World War is just this enormous global event. And the war in the Pacific is a huge part of that. And so, yeah, I was slightly terrified by the prospect of taking this on. You know, and you think, well, can I tell this story? Can I do it justice? Can I understand this global event, but can I bring it down to a very human, relatable day-to-day level? And that's what I've tried to do in this book and in all my books. And I think sometimes getting that big picture understanding of the history and the domino effect of events that lead up to an event like this group of children being moved to an internment camp, once you have that framework of historical knowledge, I think then you start to find these nuggets of really human day-to-day interaction. You know, the concerns we all have. What am I going to eat today? She's really annoying me. What's he doing? You know, why isn't anybody helping me? You know, and really, it's remarkable. Every book I write, I almost find these connections, and it's almost as if you put those people in my clothes, we would be the same. You know, and I think that's the trick to unlocking these very daunting, very distant historic events, is to bring it right back down to actually day to day. What makes us tick? What's the human condition? What are we frightened of? Who do we love? And that's what, to me, makes history feel very present and very relevant. So yeah, terrified, but I quickly connected with my two characters, Nancy the child and Elspeth the teacher, and they became very, very real and very relatable. And that really helped me to figure out the history that was shaping their experience. Yeah.
For me, when I look at Eastern countries, at China and Japan, I mean, I took some, you know, Japanese art classes in college, but it does feel like a foreign language in a way. Did it feel like that to you? And did conquering the Chinese part of it feel daunting to you? Did you already have a connection to the China front, or was that all new that you had to go figure out and wrap your brain around?
All new, apart from the fact that quite randomly, while I was researching this book, my husband, none of us have ever been to China, and it's a part of the world we have all wanted to visit. My youngest son is absolutely fascinated by the Terracotta Army and the Forbidden City and loads of things. So we had said we would love to have a big family holiday one time. And then my husband was invited to go on a business trip, and I'm sitting at home going, hang on a minute, I need to go. But actually, suppose, again, you have to decide which part of a story are you going to tell. And my first if you like, to this enormous part of the war was a school that was predominantly for American, British, and European children. So that I could definitely relate to. So Nancy, my young 10-year-old girl, I could understand her instantly, even though she's in China, because actually what was interesting, Chefu school was incredibly Western, incredibly British. And some of the children, when they talked about this in later life, they talked about it being like a little bit of Britain had been dropped into China. And actually it's something I explore in the book, is that sort of colonial ignorance to some extent of the culture around them. But my young Nancy, she looks over the school wall and she sees the Chinese servants in the school, and she wants to know more about them. Whereas from her curriculum, she's being taught about, British kings and queens and Latin, and nothing to do with the Chinese culture. So that was a real contradiction. And that was something I had to be quite conscious of, sort of writing sensitively. And I do have some Chinese characters in the book, which was really important to me, because they were a part of the children's life. They were part of the experience, and that is part of the narrative of the story as well. But I think with any part of history, you need to decide whose story are you telling. And there's always two sides, isn't there? So is it sort of from the European war, you could say, am I telling the point of view from the Nazis, or from the British Army, or from the resistance? Where am I starting this? So I would love personally to see a lot more novels about all different parts of that arena of the war. I've drilled into really a tiny piece of it, and it's really opened my mind, and I, more than ever, and of course this had to happen when we're in the middle of a global pandemic and I can't even leave my house, I really desperately want to go to China more than ever, and Japan, and see that part of the world. So here's hoping.
You mentioned earlier that the dichotomy between, and the bouncing back and forth between this 10-year-old girl and this teacher is a really fascinating part of the story. It really is these two very different perspectives, and it brings different weight to it. When you were starting, did you start with either Nancy or Els, or did you start with both?
I actually, it was always both. It was
always both.
Okay. And I think, and it's not often that happens.
Yeah.
It's a joy when it
Usually
does.
I wander around with 8 different points of view. Whose story am I telling? Or I start with this one and then it grows. No, it's a mess. Okay.
I was kind of relieved that Nancy and Elspeth turned up really quick, because I was grappling with all the rest of the stuff we just talked about, with understanding the Japanese occupation of China going back, years before Pearl Harbor, and then all of that, and everything in Chinese culture, and this actual school, and then what happened in Weishen, in the internment camp. So I think it was listening to that podcast, and then when I started researching, I found a website that some of the children as adults have created in order to document their emotions, their feelings, their experience. And I just felt I couldn't tell this story without showing the child's point of view, because that to me was the real sort of goosebumps part of this. Was, as a mother, I can't even imagine not having already seen my children for a couple of years, and then they're separated from me for 4 years in the middle of a war. And I felt it was really important to honor that experience of all of the children who as adults have talked about it, to reflect what was it like for them. But obviously this is a novel for adults, so I had to also show the adults' point of view, through which we see what's really going on. We see the real danger, either the threat or actual danger, brutality, the real unavoidable aspects of what was happening. But that also, changing from Nancy to Elspeth, allowed me to give a little bit of the reader a little bit of a respite from some of the more difficult parts of the book. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's tough. It's it's a real emotional roller coaster, this book, and it was when I was writing it, because you've got this heartrending sort of 10-year-old child's perspective on life, which is always going to be emotional, and then the reality check of a young woman who's actually struggling anyway with her place in life. But threaded through it all, and this absolutely came from my research, is this incredible sense of hope, of fortitude, of resilience, of bravery, hence the title. And that to me was just the most remarkable part of this story, was how they literally got on with it and tried to make the best of things and kept singing and kept adhering to their principles of girl guiding. And it's that very typical sort of empire attitude, which I don't think we have anymore. And I felt I really had to honour that through the Nancy and Elspeth characters, and it allows for a lot of I suppose intrigue for the reader in whose perspective are we moving to, and what is that perspective. So yes, thankfully they stayed with me, and I miss them dearly. I really, really miss Nancy and Elspeth and the others, Minnie and Sprout and Mouse and everyone.
Isn't it sort of the worst when you wrap up a book and you're like, but wait, I'm lonely. That person's kept me company for so long. Oh,
it's true. And it hasn't happened so strongly with all of my books. I think every book is slightly different for a writer. Yeah. Some of my, like for example, The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, I wrote Grace Darling, who was a real person. So it was slightly different to write her story because I was restricted to the facts of her. Whereas Nancy and Elspeth came from my research and came from reading about lots of children who were interned and lots of adults. But I could have some freedom really with their perspective on life, with their view, with their character, because they were my imagination. And I think that you feel more that you own them a little bit because they came out of your brain. So yeah, I really miss them.
So you have written both. You've written fake people that you've made up based out of real stories, and you've written about real life humans in other novels that came from history. Which one do you prefer writing? Do you have a favorite, or does it totally depend on the story? Because I've only written about the real people. I that's all I've done that I've published. I've written about other people, but haven't published them. I've written about the fake ones, but they're in a filing cabinet. I've only written about the real ones. Which one do you like digging into? Do you have a preference?
That's a really interesting question. And I think actually it depends on the book. And I don't sort of set out particularly to look for another person from history. And actually I've sort of alternated almost. So The Girl Who Came Home, my debut, was set around the Titanic. So a real event, but I created fictional passengers on that ship. Again, based on very real people, but with new names and different backstories. And then I've written entirely fictional characters. Dolly, for example, in The Girl from the Savoy, a young girl, bright young thing hoping to be in the post-war era in London. And then Heather Webb and I wrote a story inspired by Grace Kelly and her wedding to Prince Rainier. And now with When We Were Young and Brave, the first thing was the real historic event and the place, and then I've put a fictional cast of characters into that. So I think for me, it's driven by the book. And which do I feel is the best and most authentic way for me to write that particular book. Yeah.
You just listed off a bunch of your books, and I was going to ask about this because there's some stuff in common. I mean, you do write a lot of British stories. You're originally from Yorkshire, so you are British. Even though you've lived in, I found out before we just started taping, you've lived in Ireland for 20 years. So you're like Irish now too.
I'm kind of adopted, yeah.
Right. So you're English and you're Irish, but so I see that as a through line through your stories. But a lot of you've written about, 19th century lighthouses and Grace Kelly, and now World War II, and you've written about World War I in Paris. And
yeah,
do you see a through line in the stories you're attracted to telling, and or why you tell the stories you particularly tell?
Yes, actually. And it's it's interesting when you look at the settings of the books, they predominantly are 20th century, late sort of 1800s, the very sort of tail end, and then predominantly 20th century. And for me, I think what the common thread is with all of my books is something that I said at the beginning about that the human condition, the human perspective of any of these huge global events or sort of world-changing periods of history. And what I'm really fascinated in is the ordinary person. So often we've heard about history from, the victor, or from the, royalty, or, the people who were in a position of power. And what I'm naturally really drawn to, and I think it's because I'm a Yorkshire lass and I grew up in a very normal sort of, rural community, no airs or graces. That's my background. I'm from a background of really strong, earthy women. And I think naturally I find that an interesting starting point for a book. So even on the Titanic, my story is from the perspective of Irish steerage passengers, so the least wealthy who travelled on the Titanic. I really wasn't interested in the very elite and the very wealthy. And that's a similar trait I followed in pretty much all of my books, is the normal person in a very extraordinary situation, and how did they respond and how did they change as a result of that. And again, Elspeth in When We Were Young and Brave comes from a very rural Yorkshire family, finds herself sort of seeking something by going off to teach at this missionary school in China, and ends up in this exceptional situation, responsible for dozens of children when she has no children of her own. And that's what interests me. Women, obviously, are a very common thread. Strong women, slightly out of their time, sort of not following conventions, not following what was expected of them at that time. And that's what makes my ears prick up when I think about a story. And that's what I relate to. And I think that's what readers relate to, because it feels like us. It feels like, me, my sister, my granny, my mom, everyone around me. I think I can see bits of them in these people who are going through extraordinary, life-changing events, as are we right now.
That's exactly where I was going to go. I was going to say it was really strange reading this book set in World War II in China. And I kept thinking about this moment that we're living through now. As I was reading it, that the world just sort of changed, and we don't know how it's going to go back and where it's going to go and how it's all going to work out. I found this to be really relevant in a funny way. Isn't it funny how historical fiction is so often relevant to what we're living through today? I think that's your point when you write it to the individual people and you're really looking at the individual people's experiences. Have you thought about how relevant this is to this moment in a weird way?
Absolutely. And it really struck me. I was finishing my final proof edit just in lockdown. So I was in my house with my family. Nobody knew how this was going to play out. It was all very different, very upsetting, very worrying. And I was reading my pages, and passages and sentences I'd written a year, 2 years earlier were suddenly talking about my situation, about that hopelessness of when is this going to end? When this craving for normality, the despair at not seeing loved ones, and all of these experiences that my characters were going through, I was going through. And it still gives me goosebumps when I think about it, because obviously we don't know what's going to be happening in the world when our book is published, because we write, I started this really 3 years ago. And it suddenly felt so relevant. And I think that's what's fascinating with history. And I think that's why readers are drawn to historical fiction, particularly at times of turbulence like now, because isn't it comforting and reassuring to read a book like When We Were Young and Brave and follow those characters but see how it was resolved, that the war did end. People did meet their loved ones again. The world did go back to peace and normality. There was food, there was kindness. And I think it's incredible to read a book like this now. And I hope it gives readers hope that things too will get better again.
In addition to writing novels by yourself, we've already mentioned Heather Webb. You have a co-writer on some books with Meet Me in Monaco and Last Christmas in Paris. And I think you guys have another one coming out because I've been seeing tweets about it. Okay. Yeah. So which one? I mean, they're so different, right? Writing by yourself and writing with a collaborator. What's it like to collaborate with another person on a novel? I'm used to it in television production, but as a novelist, I'm like, oh, it feels so daunting. But do you love it? Like, what's the collaboration process give you as a writer?
Oh, it's so fun. And I think, you get that sort of creative buzz when you're collaborating with other creative people. And I think, we often talk about writing as a solitary process, and to a degree it is. I mean, we all have a huge team of people, editors and copy editors and publicists and people around us, but sitting at the desk day to day, it's your head, your words, your research. So I think Heather and I sort of accidentally became a writing partnership. Heather had edited an anthology called Fall of Poppies, which was based around the armistice of the Great War, and she invited me and 8 other authors to write a 10,000-word novella, sort of short story about that. We have the same literary agent. That's how we first connected. And on the back of that, we both felt that the First World War was this massive historic event we literally scraped the tip of the iceberg of in our short stories. So we started this frantic Facebook conversation on chat and sort of said, well, would you fancy doing something else? And at first we thought maybe another anthology. Then we just started, as creatives do, bang, 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 brainstorming crazy ideas, and came up with the concept very quickly of a novel written in letters exchanged between 2 childhood friends, male and female, from whose point of view we see 2 very different sides to the war, and we follow them through the 4 years of the First World War. And that was Last Christmas in Paris. And it was such a joy. I think our agent was quite nervous because she felt this might not work out quite so well, because even if you get on with somebody, being creative, being open to critique, ideas, plot, all of those things, you've literally got to leave your ego at the door, bring in the partner, and it's a true collaboration. And it couldn't work any other way. We get on brilliantly. We have very similar family lives, so we totally understand if one of us has to cancel writing for the day because some drama has happened at school, and we just have the best time. And it's almost like a little boost that we give each other to energize, to then go back to our own projects. So it actually complements solo writing. A lot of people think it would detract from it and eat into your time and be too confusing, because we're often working on joint and solo things at the same time. But we find it actually complements, and we've learned a lot from each other about how to write, our different approaches and what works, what doesn't. So we've had a great time. We've always said we'll do it for as long as we're having fun, and we're still having fun. We call each other our book wife. So, it's great. So yes, long may the Gaynor Webb collaboration. That's actually also, it allows us to just explore slightly different pieces of history, slightly different stories. Our joint books lean slightly more towards a romance aspect in the story. Grace Kelly, Wedding of the Century. First World War, you wouldn't necessarily think romance, but there is an underlying love story. So it does allow us to explore a slightly different side to history as well. So yeah, it's great fun.
It is funny because I hadn't thought about that being the same thing. I still go back and produce television every once in a while, whenever someone who I actually like calls. To your point, as long as we're having fun. I mean, I don't want to go back and produce television people I don't like, but when people I like call, I still go back and do it. And I think that's part of it. I think it's because it gets you out of your own neuroses and your own crazy whatever you're doing in your novel, and you're too much in your own head to get out, and it gives you a little bit of extra energy. So I love knowing that having a writing partner does a similar thing. I think that's great.
It really does. And often, we've actually started to help each other untangle plot issues in our solo books as well, because that person becomes a trusted sort of, wall to bounce ideas off. So, we often have a powwow about our joint book and then say, right, before you go, can I just say, what do you do about this? Yeah. So it's as you say, it has to be fun. If it becomes torturous, neither of us will do it anymore. But so far, so good.
Okay, good, because I love your joint books. I love your individual books. You guys are both great. I genuinely, I enjoyed this. I've already sent a copy to my sister-in-law because I sent her 5 books for her 50th birthday that would arrive on pub date. And so this one just arrived at her house. So this is next on her list. So I'm already giving it away as gifts for people at home. So buy it. It's really good. I've had a lot
of that, actually. A lot of readers. The book released first in Ireland and the UK and Australia, and response has just been, I've been blown away by the emotional attachment to the book. And a lot of people have said they had to instantly go and read more about the war in the Pacific, and to maybe go and rewatch Empire of the Sun, or an old BBC drama called Tenko, or Paradise Road, one of those incredible stories. And that they've said instantly to, friends, family, sisters, mothers, you've got to get this book. You'll cry, but it's so gorgeous,
and it's so worth it.
Uplifting. So that's brilliant. I love that when people do that. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And that's great that you've had such great response when you release a book in the middle of a pandemic. It's like, oh, what have I done?
Really, really stressful. And just to have the book out there in the shops is, literally sweating because it's just, everything's so up in the air. We just didn't know, would the book be published, could actually the book physically be printed, so many things, which just makes you realize how many people are involved in getting a book to readers. And I'm so grateful for everyone who's gone above and beyond. And now I just want readers to enjoy it and just remove themselves from this crazy world for a couple of days and go somewhere else. That's what books do, isn't it? So
that's what I've seen a lot of people doing with stories during all of this, and I hope that we can all continue to do that. Escape just for a moment. Our crazy heads and our crazy lives.
Absolutely.
This is lovely. You are a doll. I love you. Like, you're just fantastic. I could listen to you forever. This is so great. Anyway, I had lots of questions. Lots. I didn't get to half of them. So,
we can do episode 2 another time.
Okay, good.
Story time with Stephanie Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Story.